Oh, you are. Sorry about that. We're looking at tonight about auditing reports, but I'd like to cover something that came up in the last month from my side in the meantime, if that's okay by you guys. And that is, again, the Arboricultural Impact Assessment Report. We had those comments made by Scott, and they were useful. Certainly the idea of just letting the reader know more about what processes you've been through. So I've just been through a process exactly like that on a development site where there's contaminated waste. And now, Peter, that's something you won't get up your end of the world very often, but those in the major cities are now facing that more often. The old ash from electrical production was often available really cheap as a fill material. It's quite coarse. It was easy to put down, didn't have interface issues, but it was full of contaminants, leads, volatile compounds, all sorts of other things. So whilst I'd gone through the process, I hadn't communicated that as well as I could have. And in the process, my client said, look, why don't you, if you've got a major incursion occurring, why don't you sit down and demonstrate that you complied with 3.3.4 at each point along the way? Or at least you've given consideration to it, which is what the standard asks you to do, to consider it. So we now have a new section in my template that covers exactly that for any major incursion. We simply answer those questions in relation to each of the, I think there are 9 or so items there. And let me just pull up a report and I'll share it with you. That just shows you how we've dealt with that. And it may be something that is useful for some of you as well. Now, Peter, I believe you've got to give me control. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct.
Thank you.
How do I do that?
Same as you do every other time.
There we go.
Come on. It doesn't want to let me find you. I've got you. Okay. Share screen. And I'll share. Actually, I'll share this one and pop over to it. Okay. And if I go up a fraction more, that'll push that into the center, hopefully. Okay. Is that readable on most screens that we've got there?
Yeah.
Yeah, good, okay. So assessment of the particular trees are concerned against 3.3.4 or the standards. It could be 1 tree, it could be 10 trees, whatever. The first thing is location and distribution of the roots. And in most cases, I'll argue the same position. That is, it doesn't matter how you go about doing it. When you're doing a root exploration, which is what the standard calls it, you're not mapping all the roots. You're just doing an exploration for usually along a line, and then you'll plot or map those particular roots. So we don't know where all the roots are. We don't know what size they are. There's lots of information missing. So I make reference to that. I think it's somewhat strange that I do a root exploration process for trees on a development site, but when it comes to a transplant, I don't do one at all. I just simply say, this is standard distances, and that's where we're going to cut. The tree's in good health, and off we go. So, so location of the roots is one. Potential loss of root mass becomes even more problematic. And that is if you don't know where the roots are, and you don't know how big the roots are, then you really don't know what portion of the root mass you're losing. I think you can assume you're going to lose roots if you're going to have root severance or excavation within the root zone of the tree. I don't think there's any other alternate, but how much is going to be removed is really difficult to calculate. And I'll show you with an Excel spreadsheet a little later on why that's problematic. Have I showed you the spreadsheet before, Peter, the allometric one?
I don't think so. I don't recall.
It'll be informative for you. So anyhow, so in most cases, I argue that I can't be precise, but I can work out what percentage of the indicative tree protection zone. The indicative tree protection zone, if you remember, is the 12 times trunk diameter. What we actually end up protecting is the tree protection zone. So it's odd that we don't always call it the indicative tree protection zone, because otherwise it's confusing. But here, you know, I've got one that's 40%. That's a fair big percentage of roots that are lost. If I talk about the Australian standard, though, or the ITPZ, a standard transplant at 5 times trunk diameter is going to be removing about 82% of those roots. Now, I'm not saying that transplanting isn't damaging to trees, and I'm always of the view that the best transplant is one that you never do. But, you know, if we can move a tree and damage 82% of the, or have an 82% encroachment, then realistically a 40% encroachment may not be as bad, and in most cases not likely to be. So that's potential root mass loss. Next one is the tree species tolerance to root disturbance, and most trees that we deal with are reasonably tolerant. And I was looking for a shot last time round, and I now can find it, and that's a shot of Georgia and transplanting there. I think I did show you one last block round, but I will show you a second one from the series if I can. And I think you still see my screen here now. So if I go to my photos, and hopefully if it's nice, I'll be able to go GIA, Georgia. No, G. It's really slugging.
GEO, Mark.
Yeah, I typed it, but it's for whatever reason the system is causing my system to lag. So I'm waiting for I've hit delete, and okay, GE. Hit the E. So I don't know what's happening there, but it's really causing the system lag. Let me try just reloading the page. No, there's something there that's happening that's causing it to lag. Let me close down what I can. See if we can get that speed up. Let me try this. That's window. Yeah. No, I'm getting no response. To my keyboard. Okay. Close down some of these then. Let's see how we go now. No.
Is your keyboard connected properly? Is it battery operated?
It is battery operated, so it may need just a battery change, and I can do that straight away. So I will, just as a cautionary. I can type in the upper section, so it seems odd that I can't type in the lower toolbar there. We'll see whether that makes any difference. May have just been no, it's
No.
just. Just try again. Sorry, guys. Got to end this call.
Okay, am I right to come up there?
Yeah, now we're getting there. Okay. This is a screenshot from a recent doco movie. And again, you can see this eucalypt has been transplanted. And you can see the size of the trunk. To give you some idea of the size of the trunk, though, it might be worthwhile having a look at this one here. There's a man in the background. These are the size of the eucalypts: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus the one you saw, 6 of them moved. So, you know, we often think of eucalypts as being very sensitive to root damage, but you know, here's a gentleman who's managed to demonstrate almost the converse view, and that is they're not so sensitive to root damage. And I think that's worthwhile keeping in mind. So, you know, what species are tolerant? Well, I think I've discussed this in part before, and that's those that are in riparian zones, those that grow in shallow, low moisture soils, sandstone species, those trees that are rainforest species, they all tend to move or tolerate fairly heavy root damage. Age, vigor, and size of the tree, and it's interesting, we've talked about this in our tips videos. Vigor, vitality, and health are 3 different things. Vigor is the genetic propensity, and so, you know, a fig's vigorous, maybe maples are not so vigorous. Lean and stability of the tree, that's fairly easy to deal with, except again to address the fact that manic structural root zone is not an equation that says the tree will fail. In fact, you can go a lot closer than the structural root zone and not have a tree fail. And I'm pretty sure I've showed you photographs of that last time round with camphor laurels at Grafton, for example. The soil characteristics, again, that's usually not going to be something that's going to have a big difference. Past structures and obstacles are something that you'd need to consider if there is something that either is inhibiting root growth in some direction, or if that you've got a situation where that's advantageous. So, for example, you're removing an old footing and putting a new footing back in. And then design factors are the things that, you know, design changes or work methods that are being altered. So just putting those in and letting the reader know that you've gone through that process and you've given thought to those is something that I think adds weight when you're doing a major incursion. And hopefully from the last 3 or 4 blocks, you've got a little bit more confidence about having a major incursion. Now, major incursions shouldn't be something that are feared. Major incursions should be something that you see as a part of what an arborist is. And in fact, I've often made the comment, and Peter will testify to this, that the standard almost makes clear that if you can't deal with a major incursion, you're probably not worth paying, because that's realistically the only time you need an arboricultural impact assessment report is if you're having a major incursion. You do actually need one for a minor incursion, but it's a pretty bland document. Put up the fence here, finished, and we're all done. It's a minor incursion. So realistically, the role of an arborist is dealing with a major incursion. Not that you want to be doing that all the time, but as real estate gets more expensive, we're going to be dealing with it more. And London is a great example. And those of you who have seen Jeremy Burrell talk about the subject, protecting trees and development sites. And when you start doing things like putting basements underneath buildings and basements underneath basements, you know, you have a huge potential impact on trees. So we're seeing more and more of that sort of thing happening. We're seeing more and more infill development in our cities. I grew up in a time where a quarter-acre block was considered to be normal. Now, because quarter-acre block is considered to be a subdivision site. Peter, I think you're much the same in that time frame.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there, it's just a thought for you to take away. It was something that was suggested by a client, and I thought, yep, they're absolutely right. I'd gone through the process. I just hadn't articulated that process. And if we go back to the very beginning of war, remember we said the purpose of the report is to communicate. And, the communicating that, yes, I've gone through the thought, I'm not just coming to that point meaninglessly. You will notice that there's discussion here about my view on route mapping in terms of pressure. Generally, we want to try and keep our spray rigs, if we're using water or hydrovac systems, we want to keep our pressure so that the contact pressure at the root is less than 120 psi. At 120 psi, we start to cause cell damage. And that's worked on the reverse of the turgid pressure. So McLeod and Cram, for example, and I think you've got that in now in your documents, give us a turgid pressure of about 800 to 900 kilopascals. That's, for rough round sakes, about a megapascal. 900 kilopascals, getting close to about 130, 140 psi. So it gives you that sort of range. 800 is less than 120 psi. So somewhere around about that 120 psi, you end up causing damage. And unfortunately, both air spades or the air excavation equipment and water excavation equipment, when we need to get very close to the roots to break the soil particle apart, in other words, we're not got very frangible roots, frangible soils, those conditions damage roots when you're getting the tip of your lance or your wand close. So, the ideal route mapping is probably still once the soils start to get cohesive. So clays, for example, in most cases, it's going to go back to hand digging, and it's a horrible process. Owen, you're young. David, you're young. Have either of you gone out and done hand dug route mapping at all? Owen, you got your mic off, and David, you're
Mark, I recently did some route investigation, route mapping using ground penetrating radar, and that worked pretty well in that we found some routes and it satisfied council.
Yeah, look, ground penetrating radar does have some advantages. It is the only non-destructive method, but also has a whole pot of secondary complications that often create issues on a development site. The first being that when you're finding roots, you don't know what the tree belongs to. So if you've got more than one tree in the area, that can be problematic. You can get false negatives. And did you watch the process happening, Peter?
Yeah.
Yeah, what you get is just a graph like a resistor graph, applied a little set of beeps. And so it's not like you might think with the typical NCIS that you all of a sudden get this 3D image of a skeleton underneath ground. No, you get this hard spot, soft spot, and it picks up there's a soft spot. And so
yes, it's important to have the operator interpret that data and draw the routes on a plan or on the ground or something for you, because it's not possible to look at the data that they produce and make sense of it unless you've got some experience.
Yeah, and you can get false positives fairly readily. So all you have to do, particularly when you get lots of urbic soils, and by urbic soils, I think we've defined it before, soils typically in urban areas where there's buried things from urbanization, they can often give a whole pile of false positives. So that's more problematic. I have been reading, Peter, that there have been some innovations and changes coming through in some of that technology, and now they're talking about ground penetrating X-ray as well. But how useful or reliable that is, I don't know, and what sort of secondary issues associated with that will be interesting to see. But yes, Owen, you've been out and done some route exploration.
Yeah, I've done lots of it over the years, manually.
Manually, yeah. Have you
Yeah.
tried some with the hydrovac or with the?
Yeah, and I've done it with hydrovacs and with air spades and dry vacuum as well. I was surprised to see how much damage the dry vacuum and air spade actually did. Just how it, particularly on a tallow one is we were doing some excavation next to some tallow woods, and the air spade just blew the bark straight off the roots.
Yeah, look, and at that point in time, you might as well have just cut the roots, in my view.
Yeah.
But it's you know, you've 2/3 ring barked usually by the time you realise you've ring barked.
Yeah.
And yeah, look, it's air. Even though your compressor's running at 120 psi, which is within the limits, the way it works is using physics. It's putting a lot of air through a very small nozzle and confining it down. And as it does that, the speed and the pressure increases as a result. So you end up with this heavy point load of fairly heavy pressure. And yeah, we found the same thing. We ended up tearing off the bark frequently when we used it. We've got one. It didn't give me the results I wanted, particularly once I got into heavier soils. As you say, if you're on really nice friable soils like a sandy loam, it's a lot more effective. And Peter, some of your cradnosome clays may perform.
Yeah, it's not as bad as puggy soils or very heavy, but yeah, it's still, and it depends on whether it's wet or dry as well.
And it's a real art to get that pressure right, because you don't want to be running your lens bang smack up against the soil cut that you're doing. And so, you know, there's this desire to want to push up higher. David, you've had some experience?
Yeah, look, I've seen an air spade in operation. I haven't actually used one, but yeah, done a fair bit of hand digging. I had a job on Mount Buller just prior to the snow season starting on a snow gum, and they were claiming it was impacting some water pipes, which it was. But yeah, on a steep hill with snow around and digging by hand, I was a bit worn out by the end of the day. So an air spade or something better than that would be a lot easier, I'd imagine. But as you're saying, the damage that it can cause, it's that fine line, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is. I find it hard to get the pressures right. So I'm suspecting that I'm not the only one in that situation, and I suspect that, as I said, in most cases I can do a better job by hand with a spade, provided I'm not digging in really horrible heavy soils. The puggy clays, Peter, of your Lismore low areas, or the Cumberland clays of Sydney tend to be pretty horrible. And I've often used a hori-hori knife. Does everyone know what a hori-hori knife is?
Yeah, I have. Yep.
Let me just pull you up and I'll show you a picture of a hori-hori knife. A hori-hori knife is good if you're just going down to about 150 mils. So driveway crossovers and that sort of things. I'll often use one. I just plunge it in all the way along. K-N-I-F-E. So, you know, it's sometimes called a soil knife. As it opens up the page. So that's there, yeah, too fast. That's the sort of device there. So just plunging that in all the way along on a thing that I find a really quick process if I'm only going down about 150 mils or so. I guess you could do the same thing with the spade, but you know, you just got a lot more surface area. So I get down on my hands and knees and do a crossover that way, or a driveway. Pretty tedious if you've got to map 20 or 30 meters of it, I guess. But if it's just a short crossover, I can do a crossover in about, I guess, 15 minutes with one, and then just expose any roots that are of concern. So that's something that might be useful. It's something that, as Peter knows, I keep in my kit at all times. It's useful for all sorts of things. The really nice ones come from the US, but at the moment, everything from the US is horrendously expensive. Japan makes some really nice ones as well, a little bit more sharp, but the plastic handle ones, in my view, tend to be more durable. So one of the issues with root mapping, or this process of root exploration, is to do with the relationship of roots. And I will just quickly, if I can, Excel, EXCEL. An allometric equation is simply an equation that gives the relationship of things. And the one I find easiest is, those of you who know him, Adam Tom's had a heart transplant, a lovely guy. Adam had to have a heart from somebody between 6'6" and 6'8". Adam's 6'7", I think is correct. Well, I might be wrong. But it's in that sort of order. So why? Because you need a pump of that size to run the circulatory system in a body that size, because there's that many meters of blood vessels in Adam, and he's got more than I've got. You know, and I've got a tiny wife, so maybe Adam's stolen some of hers, but we've got this relationship between one part and another. So that's allometry. And so this is Triton-Hornbeck's equation, and it's worthwhile looking at it. So, for example, if we've got a tree with a diameter of 60 centimeters, and let's see if I can find a different Excel spreadsheet file. No, I can't do it quickly, so I have a reverse calculator. Oh yeah, I should be on this one. Where are we? It's covered. I can't see it. Standard Triton-Hornbeck. I should be able to find reverse Triton-Hornbeck. No, it doesn't make any difference. So a 60 centimeter diameter tree has 2.6 tons of material. And if we were talking about root size, we could say the same sort of thing. What sort of mass might be associated with a 10 centimeter root? Well, it'll be lighter than this because roots are not as dense as above ground material. Do you want me to? I can't make that any bigger. Oh, yes, I can. Can I? No, I can't make that any bigger. Yes, no. No, Excel doesn't allow me to make it any bigger for you to view, unfortunately. But if we talked about a 10 centimeter diameter root, it would weigh 32.4 kilograms, or the proportionate equivalent, given that root material is lighter. And we know that there's about 25% root mass generally to tree mass. So if we ignore the mass difference between roots above ground and below ground, that actually goes against our position if we're looking at the difference between the two. So it's a more conservative view by the fact that the roots are less dense. But if I'm talking about 32 kilograms, now let's go back to our 60. A trunk 60 centimeters. If we said, well, a quarter, then a quarter of 2,600 is about 650 kilograms. All of a sudden, our 10 centimeter diameter root is really not that much. It's quite a small proportion of 600 kilograms. It's 1/20th. It's 5%. Does that make sense? I can make a link available to Triton-Hornbeck for you if you'd like. It's a standard equation. So it just lets you see that. And now when you go down to a 1 centimeter root, how much difference do you think that's going to be? A 1 centimeter diameter root, now we can do, and there it is, it's 0.1 of a kilogram. So if we had 600 kilograms, that's 1/1200th. Cutting a centimeter diameter root doesn't do a lot at all, does it?
You wouldn't expect it to either.
No, you wouldn't expect it to, but I regularly see things like, for example, don't cut that root. It's got to, if you come across a root, you can't cut it if it's greater than, I can think of a local council in Sydney, 5 centimetres. Well, that's 6 kilograms. That's 1/100th of the mass of the root system. So, all of a sudden that becomes critical because I'm going to cut 1/100th of the root mass to the tree. That just seems to be crazy. So it's something to think about. That again, the smaller the root gets, the smaller the mass gets, and it's not just a linear equation. It's actually a complex parabolic equation. So you're getting a significant drop as you get smaller and smaller. And it does make sense, Peter. Absolutely, but it's just being able to see it numerically that makes a big difference. So, when in the earlier days we used to say, oh, don't cut roots greater than 2 centimetres in diameter. Well, again, there's no difference between 2 centimetres and 1 centimetre in real terms. They're a pretty small amount of mass. So that whole process in a supporting paper is what I'll be presenting at ARBOS next year. So we'll give you all the background papers and support behind it. But it's when we started to play with it, we thought, wow, it does make a lot. And when you start getting about bigger trunk diameters, then the impact becomes even smaller. So we start talking about a tree with a metre diameter trunk. You're talking about 26 tonnes. Oh, sorry, that's not a metre. That's 10 metre diameter trunk. That's better. No, sorry, 100. Then you're getting 9 tonnes of material. So the impact of cutting a 100 mil root on a tree with a trunk with a metre diameter is way less than the impact of cutting a 100 mil diameter root on a 500 mil diameter tree, for example. So again, it's seeing that difference. So realistically, how we approach bigger trees is that we can in fact cut larger roots. I'm not saying you should, but it may not be a big problem. And I guess the first time I really saw it, Peter, was a guy called Don Blair came over and taught tree protection, and I did that in 1987, 1988, came back with a few others, and we went over to Manly, and I took photographs of some araucarias that had sheet piling just 50 centimetres away from the trunk of the trees. And these araucarias are still there to this day. And I was positive at that point in time. I knew now, I was educated. I knew those trees were going to die from the sheet piling. And of course, they sit here and mock me today saying, well, didn't get that one right. And so again, that's, in fairness, araucarias at Manly are on some very sandy soils. So they've got lots of sinker roots, and the number of roots cut was not significant in terms of the tree. The tree was able to deal with that. So dealing with root tolerance, I think, does need some consideration of the size of the roots. And in my view, that's probably the only reason to go out and do the exploration work. But I hate it. It's dirty. It's unsatisfying. It's frustrating. And for those of you who have been through the process, it's then open to that wonderful thing called the liver quiver. Vicky, do you know what a liver quiver is? It's that wonderful gut feeling you get that says, yep, that will or won't work. And unfortunately, when you put a report and you say, yes, look, I'm not convinced that cutting through 100 mil root will be the end of this tree. You're doing it on a liver quiver, and the consent authority is doing much the same thing. They're coming back to you and saying, no, it's not going to work. And they're not doing it on any scientific process. They're just saying, hey, that's what we think. Well, I could have done that before we did all the root mapping. Before I did the root mapping, I thought that it was going to be successful because, it's not as bad as transplanting. And before I did the root mapping, the consent authority was almost certain they were going to say no. They just wanted me to do it so they could say no. And all of a sudden I find a 60 mil or a 100 mil diameter root, and the answer is no. well, I think we could have avoided all of that by getting out of that situation in the first place, which is a part of the reason why I hate this process of route exploration, is that it is, if the consent authority wants to say no, they'll say no. And, finding a 2 centimetre route or a 5 centimetre route is not uncommon for a medium-sized tree. But when you look at those transplants, maybe it's not so critical after all. So that's the end of the stuff for tree protection on development sites and writing the arboricultural impact assessment reports. I'm sure we'll come back to it again in time. But the next question is dealing with an audit report. And our unit, we actually do have a unit now that addresses some of this in a little bit more detail. Document and audit tree work, and we talked about how we go through that first stage of documenting. How do we specify pruning? And I asked you guys to have a look at the standard. Sorry, you guys and girls, I'll try and be as inclusive as I can, but I didn't mean to be sexist. I'm getting into trouble nowadays for lack of sensitivity. But who here had a go at trying to figure out what the standard actually says in terms of pruning? Anyone? No one bold? Okay, great. Let me pull up for you then a copy of the standard, and we'll have a quick look at it. I guess the first thing we need to do is define what we're intending to do. So, for example, is pollarding acceptable under the Australian standard? What do you think? Reduction pruning? So if I said prune to the Australian standards, and Owen, you came back and gave me a tree that was 2/3 the size, would you have been compliant with the Australian standard?
Possibly.
Well, yeah, but provided you made the cuts in the correct spot. I mean, so
yeah.
So that's why I say that the comment that standards, none of our standards are specifications. All of them give us a process. All of us give information, but they don't give us this precision of language that we need in a set of specifications.
Pollarding's in there too.
Yeah, pollarding's in there as well. Interesting, there's some mention of root pruning there as well, although it doesn't go into it. And for the sake of it, root pruning never needs to go back to a node. Just wherever you need to cut is as short as you want to make it, unless you want to put something like a barrier in or do some deflecting. But apart from that, it doesn't need it. And having said that, if you've got 2 meters of root that doesn't fork, and I can think of a photograph that I've got that shows this. They're putting in a slab. There's no branching at that point. Cutting that 2 meters of root off back behind the slab isn't going to affect the tree either, because that 2 meter long woody root is not absorbing water. Well, it's not absorbing a lot of water. Let me clarify that. Root hairs take up most of the water. There are aquaporins elsewhere which is the membrane protein that water is transported through. There are some aquaporins elsewhere, but that's usually only when the soil is getting close to saturated. So, when your soil moisture levels are running 70 or 80%, you may see a little higher uptake of water through some of the woodier roots, but it'll only be a very small percentage overall. So, you have to excuse my slowness in finding documents. They are filed systematically. It's just that there's so much crap in our server system now that's ridiculous. Standards. Is 4373, 2007. I can make this larger so you can all see it. If you don't know, there is a copy of AS 4970. Someone has illegally posted, I don't know who it is, online. I often advise my clients to go grab a copy and read it. It's worthwhile, again, for them to have some idea of what's involved in the standard, and let them see that, you know, we're not trying to be unreasonable pig-headed rat bags. We're actually being sensible about things. Always worries me when I see a committee that looks like this. It's the EVO 18 committee, and just the number of arboricultural organisations that are represented there is really lean versus a whole pile of other organisations. But at least there's a moderate arboricultural representation in the committee. And, you know, the document, I think, is a great document, and it's served our industry well. I've just got to go down one fraction so I can get the edge of it there. Okay, you should be able to all read that now. So the purpose is close these down to, just telling me there's a fillable form there. Okay, the purpose is not to look at how you should or must prune everywhere, but certainly in terms of most suburban areas, this is what would apply. And the procedures in the standard are guided by theories of branch attachment and compartmentalisation of decay in trees. Lopping, topping and flush cutting are unacceptable practices. Well, in most situations, and we come up with restoration pruning, and of course, very recently, some of our environmental pruning, which encourages some of those processes. And so there will be a need to tweak this standard to reference some of those changes. And for the sake of it, making sure that we're clear, lopping or topping is non-nodal cutting. And again, depending on the tree, that may be catastrophic, or it may be just something that's of minor inconvenience. So application for use by arborists, tree workers, government departments, building contractors and others with contractual arrangements. Got a whole pile of definitions. Most of those are fairly good. There's a couple, again, that'll need tweaking just as we've learnt more. Extruded bark, don't know where that came from except the dictionary that IACA produces. So it's an unusual use of the word, but they're meaning it's not bark, bark's not included, so it's just normal bark, or excluded rather than included. Lines tailing is a horrible practice. Flush cutting we've almost got rid of. These are major changes in the last 30 years. So if we want to see something that the professional associations have done, this is one of those things. We cleaned through our company archives about 8 years ago, and in there I found a 1994 consent form from Parramatta Council, one of the better councils in Sydney for tree protection, showing a tree with an image with the top 1/3 of the height of the tree cut off, flat topped. So, you know, that's from 1993, 94. That's not that long ago. So we have seen lots of improvements. So the first thing, it says consideration before pruning prior to being prescribed or undertaken. There's some things that we should do. Then talks about equipment disinfection. Does everyone know how to disinfect? I know, Peter, at the end of every day, you go back and disinfect all your saws. Is that right?
I don't drive a saw anymore, Mark.
Hand saw? No, I don't. And it's one of those interesting things. We talk about it, but it doesn't happen.
But no, only if there's a particular disease concern.
That's right. And probably the most common ones, Ceridium on cypress hedges that we see done for. But it's one of those things that we should be a little bit more attentive to. There are a number of things. There's some chemicals that are now sold for this phytosanitary process. But still, I think the easiest and the best is 70% alcohol, 30% water. Where do you get 70% alcohol? Well, ethanol would be great, but you're not going to go out and buy pure ethanol. So buy methylated spirits and add water, 30% water, dilute it down. The reason you dilute it down amongst anything else is that it's volatile, so you reduce its volatility. You can set fire to 70% methylated spirits, but doesn't go boom like it does when you've got a pure alcohol. And the other advantage of it is it dries fairly quickly, which means you don't end up with rusting of your stores like if you're using a bleach type. So phenol based disinfectants is the other option. And there are a couple of those that have been designed for the purpose of disinfecting equipment. But alcohol and water is probably the most convenient and most cost effective, and it does the job very well. Our three-cut system has changed. There's all sorts of debates and arguments about that, depending on what part of the world you come from. So that's another one of those changes that we'll see coming through. If you're old, Owen, like you're getting close to, undercut, top cut further out. Now some of what we're getting is undercut, top cut further in. And so again, there's arguments for and against both of those. And some of it does depend on what you want to do. So, you know, we need to think about all these things in the tree. Stem branch ridge, I'm going to argue doesn't exist. I think that's an anatomical misnomer. I think what it is this is a branch that for whatever reason has become equally dominant, but it's still a branch. Theoretically, a codominant stem cannot produce a branch bark ridge because none forms. So I know that's being pedantic, but again, it's one of those things that we've learned and we've come on. Who here is old enough to have an original copy of the Body Language of Trees? Anyone?
Oh yeah, I've got one.
You got one, Peter? Yeah, okay. I've got two if someone wants one. I picked one up the other day for about $180 secondhand. The difference between Maddox's stuff in the Body Language of Trees and then his newer text, the Encyclopedia of the Body Language of Trees. And by the way, if you're thinking about buying a book, buy that long before you buy the earlier Body Language of Trees. There are heaps of changes in that text. And those changes have come about in part as we've learnt more about trees and as our profession has become more tree friendly. Remember, Maddox himself is not an arborist. He's a physicist. Very clever man, very talented, great communicator. But again, he's learned in the process of things as well. So I think we're all in that process of learning. It's easy to pick on people, and you know, I get into trouble for doing it occasionally, but I don't mean to. I'm just saying we need to get things right. So that's one of those things that I see changes. So we've got some pruning classes. Boy, I have never seen the pruning classes ever mentioned in a set of specifications. I wonder what that is. But we've got these things and we've got these codes that somehow or other were intended to be used and were never used. And I don't know that they need to be used. But we've got these things. The first of these things is crown maintenance. And so that's great. We're going to do some crown maintenance. If that's what we're going to do, should we be specifying that, or should we be specifying what sort of crown maintenance? So deadwooding, Peter will know I have a real issue with the term deadwooding. sorry, I just noticed that we had a couple of comments in the chat, so I'll quickly address those. Susan, hand digging removes too many absorbing roots. If you're talking about the fine non-woody roots, air knives destroy them just in no time. They desiccate, and water is just got no chance. Doesn't matter what you're doing. All that you're doing when you're doing a root investigation and you're trenching is you're exposing woody roots, and the loss of a few trillion fine root hairs is not anything that's sort of an issue to most trees. Sounds like it should be, but it's not, because that woody root can continue through. In fact, if you really wanted to have some fun, you could have a woody root go through the air. You could excavate and have it go through a void and be like that for the rest of its life. That happens when you get trees that are eroded around. It's exactly what happens. So, and yes, councils do make you do it. And I've taken very recently to being somewhat insubordinate and saying, if you can't tell me how you're going to interpret the data using a non-subjective system, in other words, if you can't give me some form of published process of dealing with it, then I'm not prepared to do the exploration, because it's subjected to simply ad hoc guesswork, and we can do that now without having to do the root investigation. If they're prepared to look at something like an allometric equation to do with it, then I'm happy to go through that process. Ultimately, yes, I still end up getting forced to do it. I just fight back as much as I can beforehand. Maybe not unlike others. I've got so much work on. I don't want to be busy doing this sort of crap and spending a day doing a job that eventually ends up with the city saying, look, yep, you found, and I did one not so long ago. I got the builder. I get builders to do it for me wherever I can. I had a builder expose a 65 centimetre root on a 750 mil diameter jacaranda. And I said, well, that's fine to cut. And the city came back and said, oh no, we're not going to accept that. And my client said, but it's like 2 or 3% of the root system. What on earth is that the no for? And I said, and that's why we didn't want to do it in the first place. It's just mindlessness. So hopefully that answers that for you, Susan. Sorry about not seeing that earlier. Okay, so dead wooding. My only concern about the use of the word dead wooding is it infers that we're removing dead wood rather than dead branches. And I just really wish we'd picked a better jargon or a bit of better slang in our language. I get into trouble, for example, when I'm teaching anatomy, of calling my my two lady assistants, Danielle and Catherine, of calling them the girls. Now they don't mind. I've asked them, I've checked, but apparently that's not a phrase you can use anymore. I should be calling them the ladies, or the team is even better. Well, dead wooding sort of fits into that sort of category. Dead branch removal, as much as it takes an extra couple of words, it adds clarity. And remember, the purpose of writing these things is to add clarity. Crown thinning is the next one. And that's a practice that we're seeing really starting to die out. I don't know whether that's coming through at grassroots end of the world. Perhaps those that are doing pruning work on a regular basis may share with me on that. But crown thinning is something that has really started to lose popularity, and in part because of work by Ed Gilman, looking at the fact that it doesn't buy a lot of significant reduction in loading, and it's the tree readjusts and puts back on the canopy in much the same way, without too much change to the tree. I don't think it should be thrown out altogether. I don't think it's something that should be ignored, but got to be careful. The other issue with crown thinning is it often results in the easiest branches being cut, and the easiest branches are always those that are closest to the trunk, or normally always closest to the trunk. So you end up with getting some pretty close to lines tailing, if not lines tailing. And I think, You want to see a good example of that, and it's not a criticism of those that have done the work or those that are specified, but Hyde Park, if you look at the figures along the main avenue in Hyde Park in Sydney, you know, if you wanted to do a reduction cut, there's almost nothing. There's just 3 metres of outer canopy, whereas had the work been done appropriately, you would allow light to get back in. And if you'd like, by the next time around, just let me know either on the chat or by saying yay. Good reduction printing work can be undertaken for decades, and there's a great jacaranda being done by a guy called Gary Claxton at his house in New Zealand. He's an arborist, and it's been reduced for over 20 years, and it's probably grown maybe 150, 200 mils higher in that time. It's just about opening up, letting light come in, letting lower branches come up, reduce them back down, repeating it. Stanford has done the same thing at its campus in California with Ptosphaeron undulatum, of all things. The trees grow up, they open them up, do some reduction pruning, the new section come back in, they keep on working it back down. So I don't think that crown thinning is without value. I think we've just got to be careful with how it's done. Selective pruning just simply means figuring out which things need to be there. And formative pruning, you know, maybe formative pruning should be in its own category, because I don't think that really is a part of crown maintenance, but it's there nonetheless. So are we doing crown maintenance? I guess is the first question you want to really ask for your work, or are we doing crown modification? And it's interesting that crown thinning is not modification of the crown, but reduction pruning is modification of the crown. And in reality, they're both much the same. And Jeremy Burrell gave a talk at a ARBOS conference a few years ago and talked about reduction pruning. And the kickback was amazing. The number of people that sort of said, we're talking about lopping, you know, and this is horrible work. And this is, and that's because that was generally our thought. Reduction pruning has really gained some popularity in terms of research. A small amount of reduction, you know, a reduction of 10% of a stem or a limb can give significant reduction in load. So if we're thinning to reduce the likelihood of parts failing, reduction pruning definitely is superior in that situation. Crown lifting, well, yep, there are times when we certainly need clearance, stuff over paths, roads. My pet hate is crown lifting over buildings. And can I get a nod from those that have got their video showing? That's something that often I'll hear somebody say, I want the tree pruned up because it's overhanging my building, and I want the amount of overhang reduced. Has everyone heard of that at some stage or other?
Yep.
In fact, there actually is a code that talks about it. It's the bushfire code. I've just been dealing with it only in the last week again. Hate it with a vengeance. It's a code that says should, not shall. That is, canopy should not overhang the building. And of course, every bushfire consultant and every councillor are spineless. Did I say that? That's horrible. Mostly spineless. And so we end up with this view of you can't have branches overhang. Of course, I met with one on Friday, and very informative. She said to me, well, the reason why we don't allow branches to overhang is they can burn through, and you know, you end up with branches falling on the roof and going through, puncturing the roof, and you get fire inside the house. And I thought, boy, I've never seen that happen quickly with a eucalyptus. Slowly it can, particularly if there are cavities. And then I thought, I've never seen that ever happen on a metal roof. So I thought, yeah, maybe we should be thinking about how we input into that code at some stage or other. And maybe, again, when you see that list at the front that you saw in this one, there should be some stuff from consulting arborists in that. But I'm fairly convinced that lifting or cutting canopy from over the roof doesn't stop fire from going onto the roof, because that's about flame, and flame is blown in part by wind. So it's about wind direction. So just overhanging branches aren't a big issue. And I'm almost 100% convinced that you could dig a hole in the middle of somewhere 200, 500 meters away from trees and end up with leaves in it. Does anyone feel otherwise? So, roofs unfortunately have gutters. Gutters are systems that are actually holes. They're long continuous trenches, and they're made to fill up with leaves. That's what they're built for. The Australian standard says there should be an overflow if there's any chance of it backflowing into the eaves, which there almost always is, because most gutters are higher at the front than the back, or at least close enough to the same height. And if you try and buy those spouts or spigots, you'll notice that no one manufactures them in Australia. So I'm figuring that most gutters must be incorrectly installed somehow or other. So that's crown lifting. It's got its purpose for clearances, but beyond that, I think we really should be cautious in how we do that. One of the reasons why is you don't want things to lift and end up the bottom half becoming more rigid and the top half becoming more flexible. It's a problem when we prune regardless, but it's worse. Pollarding, what can't you pollard? Anyone?
Trees that don't produce adventitious shoots.
Trees that don't produce adventitious shoots. That's a great answer, Peter. You can't produce them once. Nearly all trees produce a whole pile of latent buds or auxiliary buds that don't come out, and they'll stay active for a few years and then slowly decline. So something like our Layton's greens fit into that category. But yeah, I think that's a great answer. So theoretically, you could pollard a eucalypt, and I've seen some eucalypt pollards overseas, and they're not bad. Not saying that I'd want to do that as a standard process, but again, I think we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Remedial pruning or restorative pruning is the thing that gives me the confidence about that earlier statement and about why we probably shouldn't throw lopping out necessarily. And I pose this question, and Vicky, I'll get you to turn your mic on because you're a lady and you understand this better than, you're another person, you understand this a lot better than somebody with Asperger's like me. I get confused, but I think this is the case. If I planted a tree on my wedding day, which I did, and it got damaged in a storm, do you think my wife would expect me to do whatever possible? We're still together and we still love each other. We're still good friends. Do you think my wife would expect me to do everything possible to bring that tree back into good condition?
Of course.
And if it lost all of its branches at the outside ends, every branch got broken off, typical microburst damage, she'd expect me to rebuild it.
That's right.
So, Owen, can you do that pruning work for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We all know we can rebuild a tree that's been lopped, but we're all afraid of the lopping process. And yet nature does it for us, and we're happy to do it. And I'm pretty sure, Owen, you do remember 1991, 21st of January, big storm, and the number of trees that were smashed, lost all their branches, that were never pruned, that were never fixed up, and they've regrown. It's been amazing. We saw some of those damaged in the microburst of about 3 years ago. But yeah, I'm constantly amazed. I'll every now and again go out and see this tree and think, oh, that's the 1991 damage that's regrown. It's sorted itself out, and it didn't even get an arborist to come and touch it. So I think that's one of those things that we need to consider, is that there may be times when lopping is appropriate, and that might be, for example, better to lop the tree than to lose it altogether. And I'll share an example of that. That's not perfect, but it will help you understand. And then I'll give you a quick set of specs that I'm using for some basic pruning, and we'll look at more specifications next time around. We're pretty close to an hour now. So photos, somewhere there by date. Where are we? I had it, no, the wrong one. By date. Photo sets from others. And this is a really great example of what can be done in terms of reduction pruning. It could be done as a reduction prune on this because we're talking about a Tilia cordata. Peter, that's an unusual tree for you, a linden or a lime tree. But the person that owns it's an anthropologist and archaeologist, one of those sort of people. And there's a building behind that he doesn't want to see. The tree's in the corner of his property. And so fair enough, he doesn't want to see things be exposed. Canopy gives fairly good screening. There's an arborist up in there getting ready to do some pruning work. We'll have a look at what he does. But he's going to do a reduction prune. And the reason why is this little pit here. There's a pit right up near the tree, and Sydney Water says the tree's got to be cut down. My client said, Mark, you're an idiot. You'll figure out some way, but please, can I keep my tree? I said, yep, we can figure out a way. So that's our tree. That's it after pruning. So I'm not going to say it's the prettiest reduction, but it still basically covers the building at the back, still gives some screening. But here's the horrible bit. We now need to expose this pit. Can you see the opening to the lid there, Owen? Yeah, okay. How are we going to do that? Well, I could only figure out one way, and that's to make a cavity. And the easiest way to make a cavity is with a stump grinder. So indeed, that's what they've done. There's the screening for it. It's, you know, it's an effective tree. And I can give you some updated shots of that, but that was in, I think, properties about 9 years ago. 6 years ago. So 6 years ago, we did that. I went back and looked at it last year during the COVID things. I had a tree nearby to do, so I knocked on the door and said, could I look at it? And got in there and I kicked the decay section out. A true hollow, a true cavity had developed. Walls 1, 2, and 3 had declined. Tree 4, wall 4 was in surviving. The client was a little concerned then. They said, is the tree going to fall over? I said, no, because we've got a trunk down low that's now a lot bigger than it ever needed to be. So, you know, could you do that with a eucalyptus? My answer is absolutely. I showed you a guy who'd moved a massive big tree with a big cavity in it. And it's one of the things that Peter and I know we've talked about before, and that is in Asia, for example, people value these things we call defects. Mm-hmm. We dislike them. They think a tree is more valuable because it's got a fault, or it's got a hollow, or it's got a defect. We've developed this sort of very much Heidelberg School of Art response in reverse. For those of you who don't know it, prior to the Heidelberg School of Art, there were seldom dead branches ever drawn on or painted on a tree, because that's not the way God wanted them to be. Well, it's like we as arborists want to do the same thing. We want to make a tree so it's perfect, rather than saying, look, this tree's got a cavity. Isn't that wonderful? And I know when it comes to tree risk assessments in schools, you know, if it's in an area where there's going to be moderate to high use, we'll say there's a cavity, and then that's usually the end of it. It's a cavity in most cases. It's not the end of the world. And in fact, it's interesting, in storms, cavities often don't fail. Other parts fail. So cavities are not necessarily much weaker than any other part. And I know I've covered that in the tips videos. Peter, I think it was the first or the second one. So if you haven't seen it and you want to see, we discuss, for example, how white stem rot or Phalaenus stem rot can often make the stem stronger, not weaker.
I recall David Evans, who was training his valid risk assessment method, making the point that when you're looking at trunk cavity, it's important to look at the wood that's there, not look at the wood that's not there, because it's the wood that's there that's holding it up. So if there's sufficient wood to hold it up, it doesn't matter what shape it's in.
Well, except that it can, the shape and where the wood is located can make the tree stronger. And I will illustrate it, seeing as we've talked about it, but go find the tips discussion and you'll see that we have discussed to some extent. And I know I took a better shot of the sample very recently for a talk in Darwin. Yep, there it is. So if you haven't seen this one before, it's discussed in tips, but the tree is round, except we've lost a whole pile of stuff here from decay, and as a result the tree has put more wood further out. If we took all that decayed material out and brought all the wood in, we'd still have more wood there than we need. So we've got more wood and it's further out. Well, more wood makes it stronger, not weaker, and further out makes it stronger. So this is an instance where the phalaenus is acting as a weak pathogen. It's actually making the tree stronger, not weaker. And you think about it, that does make some intuitive sense, that the phalaenus has developed mechanisms to interact with the tree so that the phalaenus doesn't die either. Because what happens if the tree dies? You know, the phalaenus gets to come in and take a bit of that. At the moment, it's got exclusive territory. It doesn't want failure to occur. It's happy having 100% of its own little turf rather than having to share with everything. So there's certainly advantages to that. And those of you who haven't seen Limbodi's work on it, there's a reasonable probability that phalaenus in this situation starts as a endophyte. That is, it's already present in the living parts of the tree, or at least the apoplast of the tree whilst the tree is living before injury. So it's internal. It's not something that's coming from the outside in. So again, supports this process. There's probably a mutualistic relationship of some description between the two. So, okay, some quick specifications, because I said I would, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail in the next group round. Sorry, as I went through trying to find out where things are quickly. Auto inserts, I think I mentioned before, I use a lot of stuff that just lets me find things quickly. So if I go F and say friction, find it. There we are. So some pruning specifications. Works performed by an arborist with a certificate 3 or a diploma in arboriculture. So I'm an elitist, and I apologise for those who I upset, but you know, I want some qualifications. Should be a capital C there for certificate, by the way. I think is, if I'm correct, Peter. All final cuts are made as illustrated in the standard. So, you know, it's a very simple thing to require. The cuts are illustrated. It doesn't matter whether it's a reduction cut or a pruning cut. By the way, they're both pruning cuts, but anyhow, the final cuts shown in the standard are good. They're based on good, sound research. We've probably got a little bit of more tweak to do on our reduction cuts, and our pruning cuts. We need to understand whether it's a codominant stem or a branch. Eucalypts produce lots of codominant stems, very few branches, for whatever reason that is. Whereas Tilia, for example, that we just looked at, lots of branches, which is why it's really easy to reduce. So it should be giving us some hints there. Reduction cuts are not made unless so determined by the arborist. Okay, well, you can have whatever you want there. A friction saver or a rope, a single rope technique is used for any rope access in the tree. I'm old enough to remember, and 3-strand ropes. Peter, did you get 3-strand ropes?
Yes, I've used 3-stranded ropes.
They were saws. They would cut through the bark every time. Then we went to braided rope, and braided rope's good, except if you're over about 55 kilos, in which case they act as a saw, actually act as a file. It's not so cutting. It doesn't cut it quick, but certainly damages the bark. So if you're using a double rope technique, I want a friction saver. In single rope technique, I'm happy with that being not, but anytime you're running rope through a fork, I want some form of protection. And again, any rigging will required will run through a pulley or a friction saver, and climbing spikes are not used. So that's essentially the basics. That's simply saying printing in accordance with the Australian standard. But I haven't said what sort of printing, except that here you might need to do some reduction printing. It might be canopy lift. In this particular case, it was, I wrote it for a reduction print back from a building on a heritage tree. And the city had said, no, we're not going to allow printing. And a part of the reason they didn't want to allow printing is they were not confident that the printing that was going to be undertaken was going to be appropriate. Now, if you live in a big city like Sydney, there is a council, and I won't mention its name, but it's a big city. And they require you to draw every cut that's going to be made on a picture. And boy, is that a hard process. Why? Because trees are three-dimensional objects and photographs are two-dimensional items. And it doesn't matter what you do, it's a very hard process. So very difficult dealing with how or specifying that in a way that cannot be misunderstood. And I certainly have been the victim of that. I went out the other day, looked at a site where I've got to determine how much is going to be cut. That's the file one I was talking about. And, you know, it's really hard to say, look, you know, it's sort of roughly this portion of the canopy, and do that. I've taken a photograph up through the canopy, but it's not got precision on it. I guess the perfect way to do it, and maybe one of you will come up with it, is to have a laser device that sort of prints an angle or prints a line across the tree. I suspect that when you do come up with that, you'll need to be extremely careful, because we get them in aircraft pilots' eyes. That's an offence under law, but I'm sure that there's got to be some technique like that that we can eventually use. But very difficult specifying printing, unless you're talking about just one or two branches. If you're talking about printing a lot of branches, you know, you could have dozens of photographs and have it quite confusing. So trying to specify with words has its advantages. Any questions on tonight before we say goodbye? Again, hopefully there's some interesting thoughts or words there that you can add. If you've got some feedback on it, if you think, boy, this could be improved, please share it back to Peter and he'll make sure it comes back to the group. I think it's important that, again, any way we can improve our communication. Now, I do have a far more detailed set of specifications that I'll share with you next time round, but this will cover the basics for you in almost all situations. You know, if printing was done that way in general, we wouldn't have an issue. The things that we haven't discussed there are things like what proportion of the canopy. So again, depending on your consent authority, there may be a general exclusion for 10% or up to 10%. There may be a general exclusion for size. And again, I know that we've got people from throughout areas apart from Sydney. But, you know, we have, for example, Leichhardt Council that allows you to do some things for some size branches and other things for other size branches. I think that's now called Inner West. I don't know, Liz. It is Inner West now, Vicky?
Yeah, Inner West.
So again, and then we get silly situations where we've got a local government area where there could be 2 or 3 old DCPs that still haven't been harmonised. And so just trying to get the basics down there. You'll notice in the second rendition of it, there's 2 copies of it. The second rendition, I define the standard in case in the document I'm inserting in, I haven't already referred to the standard. If I've already referred to the standard, then I can just simply use the top one, in case you're wondering why those 2 copies. And it is certificate 3 written III in Roman numerals. in accordance to the training package. So, okay, well, if that's it, guys, I'll see you next time round. Look at printing specifications in a bit more detail, and hopefully we can then go on to how you audit printing work. And at some stage or other, that's something that you'll all be asked to do, or that you'll do at least for your own sake. But it is useful to be able to do that in written form. And I'll give you the hint now, really critical when you're auditing to try not to ever make it personal. And I'm an expert at making it personal. So I have got lots of people with dartboards up in their houses, and somebody got a tattoo on the back of a bullseye. But it's trying to do that in a way that preserves people's dignity and lets them feel like they're important and valuable. That's a hard process when you're saying you've done something wrong. And to give you the goodbye story on that, I said to you the following year, after we did the first talk on tree protection, I had a gentleman come over. Well, that gentleman one day said to me, Mark, we need to have a talk. We're in, he was at Carlton and he'd been doing some training. Arborist by the name of Dick Proudfoot, wonderful man. And Dick said, we need to have a talk. And he sat down, and for the next 30 minutes, he tore shreds off me. And I can tell you, as a grown man, probably about 40 odd years of age, bursting in tears and crying for an hour or so was pretty difficult. But the one thing that I have to say is, when he was critiquing me, I knew that it was done out of the right spot, that it was being done out of love, and that he really wanted to make a change. And it was a really important moment in my life in terms of having another adult say, hey, you know, this crap's got to stop. So things like, and so, you know, arriving on time, Peter, which is why I get bad when I don't get started on time, why I like to start class in time. Providing value for money, making sure that if I promise something, I do it. Somebody shared with me the other day, and I'm still reeling from it. They said, oh yeah, consulting, I only charge X, Y, Z an hour, which is not a lot. But on every job, I usually add a couple of extra hours on more than what I've done. And I thought, I could not do that. That just is not where I sit. Mine's the opposite. I'll do 3 hours worth of work and build 2.5, because I think, yeah, well, you know, I wasn't overly productive in that 2.5 hours, in that 3 hours, so I better make it 2.5. So again, yes, it had a significant impact. So if we're going to critique stuff, we've got to make sure that what we're doing is having the right impact, not the wrong impact. So I'll see you guys in a month's time, or 3 weeks' time, if we're coming to tips.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Peter.